Well, good morning, everyone, and hope you're doing well. I just thought I'd start off a little bit about um, who we are, Great Lakes ADA Center. We are part of the National ADA Network, which is comprised of 10 regional centers and which covers over 2,200 affiliates at the local, state, and regional level. We are funded by the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, otherwise known as NIDLR, a division of the Administration for the Community Living, ACL, and Department of Human and Health Services, HHS. Our service area is designated as Region 5, which covers Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. I'm actually talking to you today from Indiana, where I work most of my time from home. And we are a program of the Department of Disability and Human Development under the College of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Our mission is to increase awareness and knowledge with the ultimate goal of achieving voluntary compliance with the ADA. We are not an enforcement or regulatory agency, but a helpful resource supporting the ADA's mission to make it possible for everyone with a disability to live a life of freedom and equality. So I thought we'd just get started with, what we're going to talk. What is the ADA? What does it cover? And your rights under Title III of the ADA, which is public accommodations, otherwise known as businesses that provide goods and services. And so key areas we'll cover today is reasonable modifications and policy practices and procedures, auxiliary aids and services, and architectural or physical access, and service animals, of course. And so to get us started, just wanted to do a brief overview of the ADA really quickly, just to remind everyone that the ADA is a civil or human rights law. It was passed in 1990, and right now we are celebrating the 32nd year of the ADA, because it was signed on the 26th of July in 1990. And civil rights are rights all people in the country have. You have the basic right to be free from unequal or unfair treatment. And the ADA gives civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities like those provided to individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. The ADA protects people with disabilities and give people access to their jobs, at school, using transportation, and community places. Moving on to slide 5, and just so you know, I did provide Sydney this PowerPoint handout, and so she'll email it to you guys, so you don't feel like you have to frantically write notes or anything. Just a reminder, the purpose of the ADA is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else, and to eliminate discrimination or unfairness in education, employment, successful communication, healthcare, transportation, physical access, program and service access, voting, and more. And the goal is, grow integration or inclusion. And as I go along, if you guys have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat box. If you want to, I'll have time at the end to answer questions. So there's a lot of definitions of disability out there. People will call me on the technical assistance line, and they'll talk about disability under Social Security, they'll talk about short-term disability under employment. And so all these different definitions are going around. So I wanted to be clear of who is a person with disability as defined by the ADA itself. And so to be protected under the ADA, a person must meet its legal definition of disability, and this can be met in 3 different ways. And the first and most important way is when a person has a physical or mental condition or impairment. So examples of physical conditions are things like arthritis, celiac disease, asthma, epilepsy, cancer, diabetes, and so on. Some examples of mental health conditions such as ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and many others. And also, in addition to having one of those types of conditions, the condition is greatly limited in a major life activity or important daily life activity. Some examples of that is caring for oneself, eating, speaking, breathing, hearing, seeing, walking, thinking, learning, interacting with others, concentrating, and many others. Major life activities include also interoperations of a major bodily function, such as a neurological function affected by conditions such as epilepsy and multiple sclerosis. You have digestive function issues affected by conditions such as celiac disease and Crohn's disease. You have functions of the immune system affected by conditions such as HIV, AIDS, allergies, and cancer. So that's the first way of meeting the definition of disability. The second way a person meets the ADA definition of disability is when they have a record of a physical or mental condition impairment. And a record of condition impairment applies when there's a history of mental illness, cancer, heart disease, or other debilitating illness. And individuals are probably much less likely to need this definition for coverage, given the broad coverage in that first definition we just went through. The third way a person meets the ADA definition of disability is when someone is perceived or assumed a person has a disability, regardless if they do or do not, and treats them unfairly because of this assumed disability. And this is called regarded as. And in the law, it protects people from misfears and stereotypes about disabilities. It addresses discrimination or unfairness based on actual or real or perceived, otherwise assumed, physical or mental conditions and impairments. Now, under the third prong, if someone doesn't have a disability, but were treated as such unfairly because they assumed they had a disability, they wouldn't have access to, say, accommodations in the workplace because they don't actually have a disability. So let's move on to a question I get a lot. What does the ADA not cover? It does not cover religious organizations only, but it depends on a certain thing. So if it depends whether or not it's operated directly by a church. So for example, St. Joe's Hospital is not operated by the church. So the ADA would apply in that situation. And so it's really important to know if it's owned and operated and controlled by a religious organization, then it's not covered. So if a church is operating a food bank, owns a food bank or a homeless shelter, then the ADA wouldn't apply. Now, if it has a church name, but it's operated by a non-church entity, then the ADA would apply. Then you also have housing. So there are 3 laws that apply when it comes to housing, and I get lots of calls about housing. So the first is residential, which is covered by the Fair Housing Act, and which would include multifamily, 4 or more units. And that's really driven by adaptability rather than accessibility. It does not have to have grab bars, but it has to be made ready to be adapted for attachment of grab bars. It's required to have clear floor space. Vertical access required when you have more than 2 floors. The second law that applies to housing is the Architectural Barriers Act. If the facility receives federal funds. In that situation, for example, no vertical access requirement and can cluster accessible rooms on the first floor. And then the third law would be the ADA, and that would cover transient lodging, such as hotels and dormitories. Think of your bed and breakfast would be triggered based on whether owner occupied and the number of rooms. So generally, your typical apartments and things, that would be the Fair Housing Act. The other area that ADA would not cover is Indian tribal properties. You have a federalism issue there, and then Indian tribes are their own sovereign entities. And then lastly, the ADA does not cover private clubs. And so high dues is not enough to meet the definition of private clubs under the ADA. They would also need to be very selective in their membership and vote on membership and etc. So like fraternities and sororities would depend on whether they are controlled by the university or not. So many universities have control over fraternities and sororities, and that situation ADA would apply. So another thing about private clubs is sometimes they'll open up their facility to the public and it's open. In that case, it's really not private. So private really has to be, it's very, very selective and they vote on membership and it's really not open to the public at all. So I figured we'd do a little quiz here real quick just to make sure I'm keeping you awake and you can, and I'm knowing you're understanding what I'm going through. So the first question I have for you guys is what we just went over. And you can just type in your answers, A, B, C, D in the chat box. What is the purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act, otherwise known as the ADA? A, to eliminate discrimination. B, provide access. C, grow inclusion, or D, all of the above. What do you guys think? Feel free to type in your answers in the chat box. A, B, C, or D. I want to make sure you guys are with me here. So what is the purpose of the ADA? What do you guys think? A, eliminate discrimination. B, provide access. C, grow inclusion. D, all of the above. Well, I see some D's coming through, and you are correct. The D's have it. It's all of the above. Let's do another one. The ADA applies in all these areas except A, transportation, B, colleges and universities, C, private housing, or D, city council meetings. Which one of these does the ADA not apply to? A, transportation, B, college and universities, C, private housing, or D, city council meetings. Let's see, what do you guys think? Which one does not apply to the ADA? So I see some C's coming through. Oh, you guys are good. You're correct. It's private housing. Remember, that's the Fair Housing Act. Good job. Another quiz question here. To be protected under the ADA, a person must meet its legal definition of disability. A, true, or B, false. Or you could just write T or F in the chat box. What do you guys think? Does a person have to meet the ADA legal definition of disability to be protected? T, true, or F for false? What do you guys think?
I would say true.
Yes, that is correct. It is true.
I don't know how to use a chat too well, so that's why
fine. That's
I hope
fine.
you don't mind.
I
Thank you.
don't mind at all.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, let's move on to Title III of the ADA. So you may or may not know, but there's several, the ADA is broken down into titles or sections. And Section 1 is employment, Section 2 is state and local government, Section 3 or Title III is places of public accommodations. And so think to yourself, what places do you think of when you think of goods and services? You know, where do you spend your money? And so goods are items that are usually, but not always, tangible, such as pens, physical books, salt, apples, hats. And then you have services, and those are activities provided by other people who include doctors, lawn care workers, dentists, barbers, waiters, or online servers, a digital book, a digital video game, or a digital movie. So a place of public accommodation means any place that is open to the public, where commerce is carried out, and that it happens when things are bought or sold, or when services are bought or sold. So on this side is a list of those types of places. And so that's what public places of accommodation mean. It's businesses that provide goods and services to the public. And it doesn't necessarily have to be paid services. So nonprofit organizations that provide services to the public, this would apply to them as well. So moving on, oops, if I can make, so I just want to let you know that ADA requires businesses to make it possible for people with disabilities to enjoy the same access to the physical buildings, goods and services, and programs and other benefits offered by businesses as anyone else. And the ADA requires businesses to provide equal opportunity to its goods and services, to participate in and benefit from those goods and services offered, to have integration and be inclusive. They cannot discriminate or treat differently based on disability and providing those goods and services. And they need to eliminate or remove eligibility requirements that exclude or segregate individuals with disabilities. So for example, showing a driver's license as the only acceptable form of identification, unless the requirements are necessary for safe provision of those goods and services by the business. So another way of doing that, instead of a driver's license, could be a state ID. That's more inclusive. You're not segregating out people with disabilities who are unable to drive. So moving on to reasonable modification or a change. So businesses must make reasonable modifications or changes to their policies, to their practices, and procedures and how they do things that deny access. So some examples: modifying a pet policy, no pet policy, or making an exception for people with a disability that uses a service animal. A dress shop has a policy of only allowing one person in the dress room at a time. That policy is changed so a person's care attendant can assist them in a dressing room. Another example, a person with diabetes brings a small, low sugar snack into a movie theater. Since there are limited selections at the concession and the person may need a specific snack due to low blood sugar, the usual policy could easily be modified for that person. So business is never required to make a modification that would fundamentally change the nature of their business, such as providing home delivery to customers with disabilities if it does not already offer that service to its customers. So that would fundamentally change the way they run their business, as an example of that. You can ask, for example, wait staff for assistance in reading a menu to you. You could ask a sales clerk for assistance for reaching something on the tall shelf. So this is looking at different ways of having the same access. So I want to move on to service animals. Majority of our calls are around service animals. And service animals may accompany individuals to areas where the public are allowed to go. Such on this slide, we have an image of a service animal sitting by someone as they order their meal, and another one where a service animal is handing payment to a clerk. So what is a service animal? So I want to go over this because there's more than one law here that apply to people with disabilities. So you have the Fair Housing Act, like I mentioned before, and under the Fair Housing Act, it has a broader scope of what animals are considered assistant animals and allowed in private housing, such as apartments. And then you have the Air Carrier Access Act that applies to air travel and service animals. And so then there's the ADA, and that's where I want to focus on. And under the ADA, a service animal is defined as a dog. And that dog has been individually trained to do work or perform a task for a person with a disability. And they don't have to be professionally trained. A person with a disability can train the dog themselves. So there's no requirement how the person's trained, how the dog's trained. So what does work or perform task mean? So the dog must be trained to take a specific action when needed to assist the person with a disability. So for example, on this slide, you have an image of a service dog pushing the automatic door opener to open the door for somebody. On the other picture, you have a service dog tethered to a young child. In this situation, the child has autism. The service dog is to keep the child from running away. So I get a lot of questions of like, what can someone ask me when I have a service animal? And so this is really important to know, and it's in the law for good reason. There is an explosion of people trying to say they have an emotional support animal and then be able to take that animal anywhere they go. In reality, they don't have any disability and they're trying to take advantage of the law. And so businesses do need to be able to vet and make sure people who are coming do actually have disabilities. But on the same token, many businesses sometimes aren't aware of what they can ask or how to ask. So on both sides of the table, there's education that continually needs to happen. But the only two questions can be asked by local government and businesses. And so that question is whether the animal is required or needed because of a disability. They can't ask you what your disability is. You don't need to say what your disability is. You just say yes or no. And then after that, if you say yes, for example, then they would want to know what work or task is the animal been trained to perform. What does the animal do for you? So if we go back to the previous slide, remember the dog must be trained to do a specific action to assist the person with a disability. So they want to know, how is that dog assisting you? And I'll get into that here in a minute, but generally inquiries or questions may not be made when it's obvious what the animal is trained to do. So let's say you're using, if someone's, if you guys can mute your microphones, that would be helpful. Thank you. Could you guys mute your microphone,
I'm trying to
please?
figure out who it is. Oops.
Thank you. But people, like, for example, let's say somebody uses a wheelchair and it's obvious they have a service animal with them, that they need that service animal because of a disability. But if it's not obvious, many times disabilities are hidden, as we all know. And so these are the two questions that can be asked. So many times I'll get people calling me saying, I had one recently where someone went to a hospital with their service animal and the security guard said they needed to provide documentation. So just so you know, businesses are not required, cannot require documentation such as proof that the animal has been certified, trained, or licensed as a service animal as a condition for entry into a business. There is no such thing. There is no ADA certified. There are individuals and organizations that sell animal certification or registration documents online. I can tell you these documents do not convey any rights under the ADA. They're useless. And the Department of Justice, which is the federal agency that enforces Title III public accommodations under the ADA, they do not recognize them as proof of a service animal. There is no such thing. So do not waste your money on getting ADA certified, quote unquote, or any license for train, because again, under the ADA, a person with a disability can train their own individual animal. Another thing I should make clear is that under the ADA, it's clearly stated that a service animal is a dog. That's the only animal that it recognizes, but there is an exception I'll get to here in a minute. But service animals must be under the handler's control, so the person with a disability's control. They must have a harness, a leash, or a tether. If the individual is unable to use a leash or a harness because of their disability, or because it would interfere with the safe and effective work of the dog to do their task, the animal must otherwise be controlled by, say, voice control or signals or other effective means. Additionally, the care and supervision of a service animal is the owner's responsibility, not the business. So the general rule under the ADA is that businesses must permit service animals. However, a service animal can be excluded when the animal is out of control and the individual, the handler, does not take effective action to control it, such as lunging at people, jumping on people, licking people. Like, it shouldn't be interacting in those type of ways because it's not a pet, it's a trained service animal. It should be under that person's control and doing its job. They can also exclude a service animal if it's not housebroken. And typically when businesses call me about quote unquote service animals being out of control and are not housebroken, that tells me they're not trained and they're probably not a service animal. The individual should be, so if this happens, maybe someone has a new service animal, they're not done training it, they're still kind of in training, and the business excludes that service animal, they cannot exclude the person from business. They need to give that person with a disability an opportunity to participate without the animal. So I get calls too about deposits and fees. So under the ADA, businesses cannot charge surcharges for service animals. So like hotels, for example, they cannot charge a pet deposit or fees for cleaning any hair, which is typical, it happens. Now, if a guest service animal causes damage to a guest room, for example, like tearing up something or chewing up the carpet, it is allowed to charge the same fee for damages as charged to other guests. So I hope that makes sense. And then I always get questions about emotional support, therapy, comfort, companion animals, and are they considered service animals under ADA? And the simple answer is no. These terms are used to describe animals that provide comfort just by being with the person. Because they have not been trained to perform a job, they do not qualify as a service animal. And again, a service animal under ADA has to be a dog, cannot be any of these forms of pets. But I did say there's an exception to the dog, and that is miniature horses. So miniature horses are permitted as a modification to a business policy when reasonable. Again, it has to be individually trained to do a task for the person with disability. And the reason this was included in law is because there are people who have allergies to dogs and that don't with miniature horses, and miniature horses live longer. So a couple quiz questions here. Under the ADA, only dogs are considered service animals. What do you guys think? True or false? Feel free to voice your answer or type your answer. I see some trues coming through. And you guys are correct. Next question. A business may not charge for damages caused by a service animal. What do you guys think? Can they business cannot charge for damages caused by a service animal? What do you guys think? True or false? I see some false coming through. And you are correct. Remember, if they damage something, they can be charged no different than any member of the public. But any surcharges of deposit, that's not allowed. So I'm going to move on to effective communication. So businesses, including nonprofit organizations, they must communicate effectively or successfully with people who have communication disabilities, such as vision, hearing, or speech disability. And they have to be able to, and effective means is that they communicate information and that's received and conveyed information. And it applies to communicating with not only the person who's receiving that good or service, but any other person's parent, spouse, or companion in appropriate circumstances. So think of like in a doctor's office, if a parent has the, say a hearing and disability or a vision disability, and they're there as a representative with their child getting the care, they would need to be able to provide them effective communication, even though they're not the one receiving the care. And so the ADA requires businesses to provide aids and services when needed to communicate successfully with people who have these communication disabilities at no extra cost. They cannot charge people with disabilities to provide these aids and services such as large print materials, accessible digital format, a sign language interpreter, readers, assistive devices, closed captioning, video relay service, and so on. And so historically, many covered businesses have expected a person who uses, say, for example, sign language to bring a family member or friend to interpret for him or her. Now, these people are often lack the fairness and specialized vocabulary needed to interpret effectively and accurately. And so it was particularly problematic to use people's children as interpreters too. So the ADA places responsibility for providing that effective communication, including the use of interpreters, directly on the business. And they cannot require a person to bring someone to interpret for him or her. And so a covered organization can rely on, they can only rely on a companion to interpret only in two situations. One, it's at an emergency. Say, you call 911 and an ambulance come and you're in that emergency situation. Two, the only other time that a business can ask for a companion to interpret is when the individual requests the use of a family member or friend, and that family member or friend agrees and it's appropriate. this does not apply to children interpreters. So even under that exception, businesses may not rely on accompanying adult to interpret when there's a reason to doubt the person's fairness or effectiveness. Some other examples for effective communication, some simple solutions. Work relatively simple and straightforward, could include writing notes back and forth to complete a simple transaction with a customer, say who's deaf, providing printed materials in accessible formats, such as large print or braille. Some other solutions may be needed when the information being communicated is more extensive or complex, such as in a doctor's office. An interpreter generally will be needed for taking a medical history of a patient who uses sign language or discussing a serious diagnosis and its treatment options. Providing assistive listening equipment to ensure a customer who is hard of hearing to attend a movie, performance, or lecture. So just some key points with effective communication. Private businesses are encouraged to honor the accommodations choice of the individual with disability, but effective communication must be the end result. And so the idea is that the person with disability is in the best position to determine what aid or service will be effective. And businesses need to really consider the nature of the communication, the length, how long is it going to take, the complexity, like those doctor situations, the context. And so all these things need to be considered to determine what is effective. So there's always exceptions and limitations with any law, right? And so with effective communication, there is an exception when a certain aid or service would fundamentally alter the nature of the good or services. And then there's an undue burden, which means that it means that maybe the nature and the cost of it's a lot. And then in that regard, you have to think about how big is the entity? Is it a mom and pop store, or is it like Walmart where they have a lot of resources? And so in looking at that, that would be a case-by-case determination. So even if a particular aid or service would result in either a fundamental alteration, meaning it would change the way the service is done, or an undue burden that it's too costly and extensive, but they still must provide an alternative that would ensure communication if one's available. So I always say to businesses and employers too, that if something isn't going to work because it's going to change the operation of the business, or it's too costly or extensive, that doesn't take you off the hook, business. You still have to find a way, another way to provide effective communication. So just so you know that, and this shouldn't happen very often. It really should be straightforward. So real quickly, I want to talk about private transportation, and this does fall under Title III of the ADA. So private companies that provide transportation to the public, they are required to be accessible to people with disabilities. And they include, but are not limited to, like airport shuttles, hotel shuttles, private buses, or over-the-road business companies. And private transportation providers that use inaccessible vehicles must provide an equal service. An example of equal service would be an accessible vehicle that services the same travel points for the same costs within the same time frame as the inaccessible vehicle. Taxis in the ADA, so under the ADA, private entities that provide taxi service are not required to purchase or lease accessible automobiles or purchase vehicles other than automobiles. If a taxi service has only automobiles in their fleet and a person with disability cannot access the taxi, then the driver must assist the person with entering and exiting the vehicle and assist the person with stowing any mobility related equipment. Now, however, if a taxi company operates a vehicle other than a car, such as a van or a bus, then that van or bus must be accessible unless the taxi company has another way to provide the same type of accessible service to its riders with disabilities. So for example, the taxi company could provide equal service for riders with disabilities who might need a ramp or lift to use the taxi service. The taxi service cannot discriminate against people with disabilities by actions including, but are not limited to, refusing to provide the service, and refuse service animals, refuse stowing stuff, or charging higher rates or fees for assisting, or charging higher fees or for helping with equipment. And then you have ride sharing, which is our newest form, right? You have Uber and Lyft. And so these companies cannot discriminate against passengers with disabilities and potential passengers with disabilities. So they can't refuse the service. They have to allow service animals. They must assist with stowing medical mobility equipment. And they can't charge higher fees or for assisting riders with disabilities. Now, some of you may have heard that the Department of Justice sued Uber for charging people with disabilities time. People with disabilities sometimes need extra time, right, to get into an Uber. Well, Uber was charging people with disabilities an extra fee for the extra time they were taking to get into the vehicle. And so yesterday, the Department of Justice put out a notice that they made a settlement with Uber. And Uber now on their website, we are going to be posting this on our social media today, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. But they are refunding anybody that experienced that and submitted a complaint about it. And they have a now process where people can certify or basically self-identify they need extra time and will not be charged that fee. So that just came out. And so wrapping up here, we've got physical access requirements. So this shouldn't be anything new. New buildings need to be accessible and meet the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, including having accessible parking, and changes to older buildings must improve access. So existing buildings have a responsibility to improve their accessibility. There is no grandfather clause or exemptions. A big one we see is snow piled into the access aisle for accessible parking spaces, and that's a violation. That snow needs to be removed. We have to do a lot of education in that area as well with businesses. So some more questions for you guys real quick. Let's see here what you've learned. So the ADA includes a grandfather clause or exception for existing buildings. What do you guys think? True or false? Is there a grandfather clause for existing buildings where they don't have to comply?
False.
False, that is correct. A doctor may require a deaf patient to bring their own interpreter. True or false? Can a doctor require a patient to bring their own interpreter?
False.
False. They cannot. The doctor is required to provide effective communication and provide the interpreter themselves. Okay, last question in this area. Businesses can store snow in the blue striped access aisle of an accessible parking space. True or false?
False.
False. So another area I wanted to go through real quick, which is a big one that comes up, is disability discrimination, which occurs when a person is treated unfairly or poorly, or they're put at a disadvantage for a reason that relates to their actual disability. And a person is treated less favorably because they have a history of a disability, or because they're believed to have an impairment. And also occurs when a family member or a friend is treated poorly because of their relationship with a person with a disability. So that's disability discrimination. And so let's go through a couple disability discrimination scenarios as it relates to business. So here's your scenario. Put your thinking caps on here. LaWanda uses a wheelchair and she goes to a local restaurant with her boyfriend, Lou. When they arrive at the restaurant, they must wait 30 minutes to get a table. The waiter is very rude and the food is terrible. Has the restaurant violated LaWanda's ADA rights? Yes or no? What do you guys think? So you have a wheelchair user with her boyfriend, go to a restaurant, they wait 30 minutes, and then the waiter's rude and the food's terrible. Has there been any ADA violations? Yes or no?
I don't think so.
I would say no, right?
No. You know
Oh,
what? Everyone can experience waiting a long time and getting bad food and terrible service, right?
it happens to me all the time.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Seems like more so now than ever. All right, let's look at
Yeah,
another
amen
scenario.
to that one.
Okay, scenario number 2. You have Darlene's Bar and Tavern, and it's been operating out of the same building for 35 years. That's longer than the ADAs existed. And the bar has a parking lot with no accessible parking spaces. The parking lot has never been resurfaced, never had striping, has never been done. Has the bar violated the ADA?
I would say, yeah.
Why do you
Yes.
think? Why do you say yes? You're right, but why do you say yes?
Well, I think because it looks terrible, how do you get in a little shack like that? Second thing, how do you know where you're supposed to be parking? You know, if you had a wheelchair and
Right,
that kind of stuff.
but why do they
um,
have to do that? It
Because
exists,
it's a law. It's a law.
right? But
It's a law.
so this, even though this building existed before the law was passed,
Yeah.
and remember, there's no grandfather clause, they still
Mhm.
have to provide access.
Mm.
So what can you do when a business denies you access or discriminates you because of a disability? So I always say to people, start at the lowest level because you're going to get more effective change that way, quicker change. Because the further up the chain you get, the higher level you get, the slower it gets. So if you can
Okay.
start with the owner of the business or the manager, I would start there. So if you have an employee, say a sales clerk or a hotel check-in person who denies you access or is discriminatory towards you, then I would contact their manager. I would contact the owner of the business because maybe they're not aware of what their staff's doing. And then that you might have a manager or an owner who wants to do the right thing and can educate their staff and
Mhm.
remove that barrier and provide you access. So that's the easiest way. So for example, like hotels, sometimes our hotel chain, like Holiday Inn, right? So if you go to a Holiday Inn and you don't get access, call the national hotel chain because typically those chains have ADA policies. So like Walmart, for example, the big Walmart has an ADA policy. And so if you have an issue with a particular store and the manager of that store is not helping you, then elevate it to the corporate level, right? So work your way up. Now, if the corporate and the manager are still not willing to work with you, then you have 2 other options. You can file a complaint with the Department of Justice. And when you guys get these PowerPoints, you can click on these blue underline words here because these are links to the direct web pages. And
Mhm.
so there's no time for filing a complaint. And the business can be fined up to $75,000 for first offense and $150,000 for any other offenses. You do have the private right of getting a private attorney, and that would remove a barrier and be a provision of accommodation, and there is attorney fees. And then you could also file a complaint within 300 days from the day the disability discrimination occurred with the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development. If you click on this, it's going to take you to that section that covers public accommodation. So just be mindful if you do with Wisconsin, you have 300 days from the day that the disability discrimination occurred. So you can do DOJ and Wisconsin, you can do both. You don't have to do one or the other. And then, so many people aren't aware of this, but every state is federally mandated to have a protection and advocacy agency that advocates for people with disabilities rights. And for Wisconsin, that's called Disability Rights Wisconsin. And like I said, it's federally funded program, so there's no cost to people with disabilities to use their services. And what they do is they serve people across the spectrum of disabilities to protect against abuse, neglect, or wrongdoing, and to enforce the rights of people with disabilities. They provide advocacy, legal support, and rights protection. And they have programs that have been expanded over the years, and it does include, they have information referral, technical assistance, individual case representation, appeal or litigation in court, systemic advocacy, and they do provide training such as learning how to advocate for oneself. So that is a free resource to you, and encourage you to check it out. And you can check out their website here if you click on the link.
Mm.
And then just a little bit about us. If you want to learn more about disability access, you can visit our website here for technical assistance, information, education, training, resources.
Mm.
Some highlights of our website includes you can sign up for our listserv to receive our information regarding the ADA. So like yesterday, we sent out on the listserv the settlement with Uber. So if you sign up to be on our listserv, you'll get real-time information of what's going on with agencies on lawsuits and things. You could also subscribe to our Chronicle, which is our e-newspaper, electronic newspaper. And it comes out every month, and it provides the latest revisions of the law, any upcoming training, resources. We have tools. We have regional news. So if you want to learn about anything happening in Wisconsin, you can check out our Chronicle. We also have legal briefs, fact sheets, and toolkits. And additionally, we provide tailored trainings like this one upon request. And so if you want a training, you can email us at webinars@adaconferences.org. If you have questions specific to the ADA, you can call our toll-free number, which is listed here on the slide, or you can email us your questions, which is also here. We do have a video phone number. And our hours are 8 to 5 Central Time, Monday through Friday. And if you want to learn more about the ADA, I encourage you to visit our ADA training website. We have lots of webinar series. Today is our ADA audio conference series, and the Department of Justice and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission are giving us an update and to celebrate the anniversary of the ADA. And they're all free. All our webinars are free, and they're all archived. So if you miss one, you can go back and listen to the archive. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at ADA Great Lakes for ADA tips, accessible fails, announcements, and resources. And we also have a YouTube channel where we have a conversation spotlight series where we have a conversation with people with disabilities, sharing their experiences for others to know.
And we have a YouTube channel too, Sydney and me. I started with a couple more people, but Sydney's also on it. So if you want to check ours out too, we got a lot, and maybe we could interview you eventually, about the ADA, right, Sydney?
Yeah.
It'd be kind of nice to have that on our YouTube channel too.
Cool,
And I got one question.
Yes.
About, like department stores.
Yeah.
Like Kohl's, and they just seem to be shoving things in. So a few weeks ago, I brought up, I said, how do you think people went to the Manor, one of them, and said, okay, how do you think they're gonna get through? So they got everything crammed in there, and the wheelchair I know can't get through there at all. A lot of those aisles and, the Target, Kohl's, even some of the grocery stores, they got things out in the aisle, so it catches your eyes, but they don't understand if somebody's in a walker or a wheelchair or even on a cane or something, they trip over that. So is that a violation?
Yes, so we actually did a social media post on this very issue. It was an accessibility fail, where we talk about how department stores and even grocery stores, they have those display cases, right? And in between aisles. And we show that it's a disability fail because you have to have that 36 inches to get through, like thrift stores, right? They like to cram everything in and you can't get through.
Yeah, that's right.
So yes, they need to have 36 inches so people can get through. So in that case, you can advocate and educate and share what the requirements are, for sure.
Thank you so much.
And I would also recommend if you see that happening, like you see that in lots of different stores, I would encourage you to
Uh-huh.
contact the Disability Rights Wisconsin, because
Uh-huh.
they can maybe help you guys advocate on that. It's called a systemic advocacy. This is a big problem happening in many stores, and educating those stores of that requirement. So I can't stress enough, this is a great resource to help make those changes for your state. Any other questions?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
It looked
Well-
like Larry had a question,
let's see here.
and he's raising his hand.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if they're, I'm trying to think, if you have an accessibility issue
Mhm.
and they won't fix it, who can you go to?
Right, so
And the other question is, do you have a copy of this PowerPoint you can email to us?
yeah, I sent it to Sydney, so she can send it to you guys afterward. But on this slide, this is what you can do. So again, if you've talked to the business and they're not willing to help you, then you can always contact a few places. You can contact Disability Rights Wisconsin to help you advocate for your rights. They might be able to call that business and have a conversation with them. You can always file a complaint with the Department of Justice, which is on this slide 35, if you can see it. You can also file a complaint with the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development. But like I mentioned earlier, I really encourage you to try and work with the business owner. And if it's part of a chain, call the chain, the corporate level, because they may not be aware of what their stores are doing and being able to enforce those stores to do what they need to do. But if those efforts aren't working, then again, you can file a complaint with Department of Justice and the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development.
And the other thing real quick is, power wheelchair users, are people like Uber required to provide access?
Yes, people with disabilities are required to have access. So they need to assist you if you need help loading your mobility equipment into the car, and they cannot charge you for extra fees for
I
wait
mean, how
time.
can they provide power wheelchair access to me?
So if you can transfer into the car, then they need to be able to then put your chair, if they have room for it, in the trunk.
If they don't have room for a power wheelchair?
So they don't have to, so if all they have is cars in their system, they're not required to make them accessible.
They're, in that case, they're not, right? So like
Correct.
Uber wheelchair accessible vehicle service might be needed in your area first.
Yes, if they provide that, that would be great. If they're not required to provide it.
Okay, that was the extent of my question.
Okay.
Looks like
Eh,
Denise has her hand raised.
Denise, what's your question?
Yeah, and I don't know if you covered this but I go back a long way, like when the ADA was first written. Okay, isn't there a guideline that says it all depends on how when the business was established and their amount of money that they're making for the modifications as to whether they're required to make them modification or accessibility?
Are you talking about physical access?
I guess I worded that wrong. Like when there's something in there that says, when does the state law supersede the federal law?
Okay, so some states have disability laws, right, that go above and beyond the ADA. And so whatever law provides the most access is the one that needs to be met. So in the state of Wisconsin, if you have a disability law that would provide even more access than the ADA, then that would be the law that would trump it. Now, if you don't have state laws, then the ADA would be the one that superseded. So whatever
Okay.
law provides the most access is the one that needs to be met. Does that make sense?
Okay, but they have to accommodate in any way, right? I mean, if they never provided accommodations before, then they would, even if it's not financially applicable for them to, they have to make a reasonable accommodation, right?
They need to do their best efforts. So if you're working with like a mom and pop store where it's just a family owned business and they don't have a lot of resources, then they need to take their best efforts to make their business accessible. And so maybe that's taking tax credits for if it's physical access. And it's finding another way to provide access. So for example, I had a call where someone had a business in a church basement. And they were providing a program, then they asked if they provide the program on the main level of the church as a different way of providing that service, would they then be in compliance? And the answer was yes, because on the main level, anyone could access the main level. It was just the basement stairs that was an issue. So they found another way to provide that program access. And so that's what we're saying here is that on the surface, right out the gate, if it's not accessible, the business is on the hook to find another way to provide that service. And if it's something that's costly because it's private, it's just one person owned, they need to think outside the box of another way to provide it. I always say there's usually more than one way to do something and accomplish something. It's taking the blinders off to think in a different way to achieve the same outcome. And I mean, look a different way, but at least you have the access. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Sydney.
Bye,
And I'll
Cindy.
talk to
Bye.
you guys soon. Love you. Bye.
Nice meeting you.
Oh, nice meeting you. How do I get out of here?
So on this last side that Sydney will email to you guys is the Department of Justice main website. If you click on this, it'll take you to their main website. And it's their new beta site. I really like it. It's so much easier to digest and get the information. I myself have a learning disability and their old site was too busy and hard to digest. Their new site's a lot easier to digest and access. And they have these great pages on these common topics. And one is service animals, one's parking, one's effective communication, mobility devices, and they also have one on businesses. And so I encourage you to click on these and check them out when you have time. Again, and Sydney has this. And Sydney, I will email you the PowerPoint with the answers as well.
Okay.
I didn't want to give that ahead. I didn't want to give you guys the answers. But we have a couple more minutes. Did anyone else have any more questions? Lawrence and Denise, your hands are still raised. Did you still have more questions?
No, I'll take it down. Thank you. I forgot.
Well, I hope you guys found this helpful.
Yeah, it was a very good presentation. I learned a lot.
I know ADA is a lot to digest. But if you guys have more questions afterward or anything comes up, feel free to call our 800 number or email us your questions at any time.